Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our WatchGuard webinar, Internet Security Report Q2 2020, also known as Top Security Threats Worldwide. So first things first, the quick housekeeping items is that the audio can be through your computer and dial-in. Second is that there is a Q&A box. All questions will be answered at the end and throughout. The on-demand recording will be sent via email and available on the webinars page of our website. And for CPE credit, this webinar is for an hour, so it'll be equal to 1 credit. Please check in with your certification body for more details. So without further ado, Corey, take it away.
Thank you so much, Christine, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, depending on where you're joining us today. Sorry, it's morning here, if you couldn't tell, and I'm still drinking my coffee. But we really appreciate you jumping in to hear about our Internet Security Report for Q2 2020. Before we dive in, I'll quickly introduce myself. I'm Corey Nachreiner, Chief Technology Officer at WatchGuard. Among a lot of duties here, one of my main passions is running the WatchGuard Threat Lab team, which I started well over a decade ago. A team of folks that kind of keep their thumb on the pulse of the internet underground, the threat landscape, to see what bad guys are doing so that we can protect our customers. But to learn more about it, I'll hand it off to Marc for a second to introduce himself as well.
Yeah, thanks, Corey, and good morning or good afternoon, evening, everyone as well. Like Corey mentioned, I'm Marc Laliberte. I'm a senior security analyst on the threat research team. Technically, I manage the team, but you're never going to see manager in my title because, unlike Corey, I like to try and keep my street cred. Despite cutting off my mohawk, I guess I kind of got rid of it there. Corey, if you want to hop on to the next slide, though, I'll introduce the rest of the team that helped out with this report. It's not just us every quarter putting out all this good information. We've got several others on the team that assist as well. Trevor Collins, one of our security analysts, and Ryan Estes, who actually works on our DNS watch team as well, dealing on the front lines every day of inspecting and analyzing phishing attacks and malware command and control attacks. Both of them contributed to this report in various sections on how this threat landscape is affecting not just our customer base, but everyone out there on the internet.
Yeah, and why don't we dive in, because we want to see if we can keep some time for questions for once. But I'll cover today's agenda, which is really, again, to cover the Q2 report. And if you've read our report before, we kind of have a couple different sections of it. The main section is our Firebox feed trends. And Firebox feed is just a technical or a marketing name for the feed of information we get from participating fireboxes. Fireboxes being the network security appliance that many of our customers use. And for ones that participate, you'll see the numbers for that soon. They share all the malware information and all the network attack information for threats they're seeing. We have multiple different ways to catch malware, which we'll talk about, and multiple different ways to catch different sorts of attacks. So we share the top malware highlights. We'll share those stats this quarter, including we'll go a little deeper into 2 of the big threats we saw for the quarter, and as well some of the network trends that we saw as far as network attacks. And finally, I can't forget the Firebox also has something called DNS Watch, which is basically a DNS firewall. It's able to block different types of malicious sites, phishing sites, malware distribution sites, command and control sites, etc. By using DNS. When your users first do a DNS request, if they accidentally click a bad site, we can block that. So this quarter, we'll talk about some of the malicious domains that we blocked throughout Q2 2020. Besides the Firebox feed section, which is really the quantifiable information coming from some of our products, we also tend to have a research section or a top incident for the quarter. And this quarter, we went with the top incident, where if you were paying attention to the news, you might have saw, or I guess it's last quarter now, by the way, in Q2, an organization called Shiny Hunters leaked a lot of breach data. And since we have our own dark web scanning tool where we can share the credentials of yours that might have been leaked on the underground, we follow this kind of stuff pretty deeply. So Marc will go into some detail about these Shiny Hunter leaks and maybe try to unveil where those leaks might have come from. Now, of course, the whole point of this report isn't just to scare you with all the trends of malware and network attacks, but more to kind of educate you on what are the types of techniques attackers are using so that you can pair the proper type of defenses with them. So throughout the report, and definitely at the end of the report, the presentation, we'll be sure to share some defensive strategies that can help you protect yourself from that. But with that said, I think I'll turn it over to Marc for the Firebox feed.
Yeah, so like Corey mentioned, a large portion of this report is built around threat intelligence that we get from Firebox security appliances deployed across the world, across our customer networks. All this data comes in anonymized before we put it in the report, so we're not sharing any information on like where you're browsing or what you're trying to do. We're strictly looking at threat intelligence of security service triggers as they impact our customer networks. We put out this request every single quarter, but I'll say it again, if you are a WatchGuard customer or a WatchGuard partner, take a look at the send device feedback option within your Firebox's configuration. It's under the general settings. If you tick that box, it'll send us some threat intelligence, but as well as a bit of telemetry to help product management make decisions on what services to focus on additionally in the box itself. But most importantly, that checkbox sends us the threat intel anytime that you block a network attack. So the Firebox feed in this report is built up of a few different sections now. We're continuously adding new services to it as we get threat intel feeds turned online. But as of right now, it includes Gateway Antivirus, which is our legacy signature-based anti-malware engine, Intelligent AV, which is a machine learning AI-based engine, and APT Blocker to round out our anti-malware with its behavioral sandbox-based detections. If you aren't familiar with our services and how they work, basically they work as a layered cake where first potential malware will go through the signature-based antivirus service. If that comes back clean, it'll go through Intelligent AV, which will run it through that AI model, and then it'll hit APT Blocker for the definitive thumbs up or thumbs down. And so we get a good look of malware, both from starting with the very widespread, well-known, easy to catch threats, all the way down to the most evasive malware attacks. Behind that, though, we also have intrusion prevention service, which we call network attacks or network exploits in this report, where we can look at the types of vulnerabilities that attackers are going after in web applications and web clients, or basically anything that connects to a network. And then also rounding it out is DNS Watch, which is our DNS firewalling service, where we look at phishing attacks from links that people click on in emails and malware botnet command and control connections as they beacon out to wherever their command and control server is. So with that, let's go ahead and move on to an overview of the top malware trends for this quarter. And some of the key things that stand out is, first off, we actually had a slight decrease from the previous quarter in participating fireboxes, about 5%, which is well within our norms for fluctuations quarter to quarter. But going along with that slight decrease in fireboxes, we actually had a pretty substantial decrease in two classes of malware. So first off, that signature-based anti-malware detections dropped 24% quarter over quarter, which is a pretty significant drop. We've kind of chalked this up to similar to quarter one, with a lot of folks moving to working from home instead of working in the office, which means we tend to see less traffic through the network perimeter of those offices that these fireboxes typically protect, which could account for that drop in just overall malware volume. Intelligent AV went down a bit as well in detections at 29%, but because of the restrictions on the classes of fireboxes that it runs on, it accounts for just a small piece of the pie when it comes to overall detections. So even with those two malware classes dropping, detections from APT Blocker, so our service that catches the most evasive malware threats, actually increased quite significantly, 12% quarter over quarter to well over 10 million detections. So even though malware as a whole was down for the quarter, the evasive malware threats that we saw were up quite considerably. And that brings us to this zero-day malware number that if you're a frequenter of these webinars or our security report, you're well familiar with, but it still deserves a good explanation. When we talk about zero-day malware, we're not talking about malware that exploits a unpatched vulnerability. It's not a zero-day exploit. When we say zero-day malware, we're talking about malware that doesn't have a signature or gets past signature-based detections. And that could be because it's entirely new malware. It's something that signature-based engines have just never seen before. Or it could be an attacker has taken an older payload and run it through tools and services that help it evade these signature-based detections. There's things like packers and cryptors that are available for free or even better ones for a little bit of money on not even just the dark web, but even underground hacking forums on the regular old internet, to make it really easy for even low-skilled attackers to take any old malware payload and make it evasive enough to get past our traditional legacy anti-malware engines. So for Q2 of this year, that share of malware we saw that got past signature-based anti-malware services was 67%. So that means if you're just using traditional legacy anti-malware engines, you're missing 2/3 of all malware that's out there. And this isn't the highest we've seen it. It is still quite high, but
I think it's only a percentage off the highest, if I remember right.
Yeah, but it is still, it's a significant portion of malware to be missing if you're using just one layer of security. This is why you need those multiple layers of different types of anti-malware engines to catch these types of threats that are out there.
By the way, for the math nerds, I figure before we jump in the next part of this, I just want to give math nerds a few caveats about these numbers. Just so you know, our product, our Firebox, has two different suites. One is basic security, and basic security includes our basic gateway antivirus service. Then there's total security, and total security is the one that includes the more advanced malware protection Marc was talking about, intelligent AV and APT blocker. So one thing to note is you might notice GAV numbers look very, very high, especially when you get to that 67% thing. Realize that that number also includes people that just have basic AV, GAV. So when we're doing the 0-day number, we don't calculate those boxes in, we only calculate the boxes that actually have APT blocker and an intelligent AV. And I also, sometimes we get the questions that, there's different ways to block signatures. Intelligent AV is, as mentioned, machine learning, and APT blocker is behavioral based. But some people are like, well, intelligent AV, machine learning must not be doing well. The one other thing to know about intelligent AV specifically is because the machine learning model is it uses some resources, it's only available on our rack mounted security appliances. It's not available on tabletop appliances. And just because many people have branch offices, a lot of organizations tend to have more tabletops than they do their headquarters rack mount. So don't think intelligent AV is not doing as much as others. I think part of its numbers being where it is simply because it's not on the tabletop boxes. Sorry about that, Marc. Go ahead and continue.
No worries, business Corey. So another stat that we added just in Q1 of 2020, so just last quarter, was where we look at the percentage of malware that arrives over a encrypted web connection. So now we've got telemetry, or within this threat intelligence, we can see whether or not the malware payload was over HTTP versus HTTPS. And last quarter, if you remember, it was actually quite high. It was something like right around 2/3, 60-something% of all malware came over an HTTPS connection. This quarter, though, it dropped down to 34%, which it feels low. It is quite a bit lower than last quarter, but it is still 1/3 of all malware arriving over an encrypted channel. And we want to point this out because there are still a large number of our users, and I feel like network administrators across the entire industry, that don't turn on HTTPS inspection tools on their network perimeter. And so if you don't have that HTTPS inspection enabled, you're missing 1/3 of malware straight through your perimeter. And obviously you can still use endpoint agents to try and catch those threats as they arrive on the endpoint, but you're basically missing an entire layer of your security at that point.
Yeah, and speaking of TLS encryption, Marc, this is, I figure we should try to be as interactive as we can on a webinar, so I'm going to throw one of the audience questions at you. I probably could have brought this up as much in DNS Watch as I could here, but since we're talking DNS, one of our audience asked if we had time, he'd like to hear if we're working to address DOT, otherwise known as DNS over HTTPS, when it comes to finding malicious domains and other things. Do you have any thoughts on DOT? I think we have podcasts talking about it that I definitely recommend our audience go check out, the 443 podcast.
So when it comes to encrypted DNS traffic, there's a few different standards. There's DOT, so DNS over TLS, and there's DO, so DNS over HTTPS.
And by the way, DO is what he asked about, not DOT. So you're
Okay,
right.
cool.
I was thinking of DLS because we just talked about it, but DO is specifically what he asked about.
Yep. Our engineering team is actively working on supporting this standard, both in making it easier to disable DO and still use DNS firewalling services like DNS Watch on an enterprise network, which is still doable on the browser level, but we're working on making it easier. And then also just supporting it ourselves, because we recognize that protecting the privacy of your users from people snooping on the internet is still really important. So it's something we are actively working on. I don't think we have a current solution for it in DNS Watch right now, but it is being addressed because, I mean, personally, DNS over HTTPS is something I'm really excited about and really personally pushing as well too. One last stat I want to point out about these encrypted malware deliveries is that even though the percentage is down, the volume that we saw this quarter was up quite considerably from last quarter, which is good news because it means that more people have enabled HTTPS inspection on their Firebox appliances out there. And again, I'll say, if you aren't doing it right now, it is easier now than ever to accomplish that. You basically just have to deploy a few certificates, and there's many ways of doing that. And it can help give visibility into this network traffic that you previously couldn't see into.
Cool. So to summarize, overall, malware is a little bit down at your headquarters because folks are at home. However, the sophistication of malware is up with lots of zero-day malware. So moving on, we won't go over everything in the top 10 lists in this call. Definitely check out the report when it releases midnight tonight or tomorrow morning, I guess. But the first thing we'll look at is the top malware by volume. For both network attacks and malware, we take a look at the top list in two different ways. One is by pure volume, where we simply count the number of instances we've seen an attack or malware. The other is what we call the widespread top 5. And the widespread is less about pure volume and more about its reach. How many different individual customer devices did the malware or network attack touch? So this is the one by volume. I will say, of our lists, the network attacks list, as you'll see soon, doesn't change all that much, we believe, because it's mostly automated. Malware changes a little more regularly, but there's a lot of regulars on this list. To start with, there's really only 3 new things on this list, but of note, one of those new things took the #1 spot, and that's Trojan Gnaeus. Won't go into a ton of detail about it now because Marc will be talking about it, but it hit a full 20% of the malware we saw was this particular Trojan, which, as you'll see, is kind of a scam script that Marc will go into more detail about. Besides that, some other new threats. One I'll talk about a little later is a Trojan that comes in an Excel document called Abracadabra. That was also new this quarter on the list. And near the bottom, we also had a generic Linux script being caught, which turned out, when we looked at the hashes, to be a well-known Wi-Fi attack tool, AirCrack. If you've heard of pineapples, which a lot of our sales engineers use in demos, or before pineapples even existed, if you were doing any web cracking or trying to brute force WPA and now WPA2 and 3 keys, you probably are familiar with AirCrack. So we'll talk a little bit more about Gnaeus and Abracadabra going forward, but it was interesting to see kind of one of those grayware tools. AirCrack is not necessarily malicious. You know, pen testers, a lot of time people like us or good guys are using it, but it showed up for sure. Besides that, we'll talk a little bit about in widespread attacks too, but some of the familiar things like the Trojans, Harry and Helm D, keep on popping up on our list. And notice when you see CVEs, that 2017 11882 and the RTF issue below, those are kind of Word or Office vulnerabilities that affect Word, Office, and PowerPoint documents. So really 3 new things, 2 of which we'll get into more detail soon. Now, let's also cover the widespread list, and the widespread list changes a little bit too. A lot on this list is a kind of a repeat from Q1, except for one, which is a JavaScript pop under. We're not going to cover it too much in this particular webinar, but you should definitely check out the report, as we do highlight it in a little bit more detail in the report. In short, it's kind of trying to get ads to folks and get them to malicious sites, but it does so with a pop under, which is kind of a hidden pop-up window that tries to make itself hard for your users to click out of. So that was definitely interesting, and we have some details in the report. Besides that, the one thing we've been noting in a lot of the widespread malware lists is this list tends to contain those document-based exploits. For instance, that Office CV I mentioned before, and you can see two different RTF, which are again Office related when they're dealing with real text format, vulnerabilities that affect the Office frameworks. So we're seeing a lot of malicious Office documents affecting folks. Besides that, you might notice in the widespread list, we also share where these exploits or pieces of malware are most seen. It is interesting that we saw Cyprus a lot this quarter, as well as Greece. So a lot of these Word documents are targeting specific countries. And you can see that really a lot of it was in the EMEA, the European region and Middle East region, and lesser so in America, which is unusual because in the past we have seen a lot of document-based threats go after US victims. So that's a quick high-level view of the malware. But to keep things moving forward, why don't we go into depth about our number one threat? And with that, I'll hand it off to Marc.
Yeah, so it was actually really interesting seeing this not only first pop into the top 10 list, but shoot straight up to number one in the list just over the course of a quarter. So obviously we wanted to dive in and see exactly what it was doing. We got our hands on a few different payloads, and most of them came down to this very similar script that you see right here. Where it's obfuscated JavaScript, not very well obfuscated, but it's still obfuscated, meaning the attacker has tried to hide what it's doing by dynamically building out strings and functions within the code. In this case, they basically just have an array of numbers that they run through a loop and ultimately turn into a string. So that loop does some basic arithmetic on the numbers and ultimately turns them using this from char code at function that's built into JavaScript into I think it's a UTF-16 character, and ultimately spelling out a URL, which it then calls into a function, or which it then sets into a variable within the Java document, window.top.location.href, which is again encoded in this screen. And for anyone that has familiarity with JavaScript, you probably already know what that does. But for those of you that aren't JavaScript coders, if you set a URL into window.top.location.href, you're basically changing the address of the web page that the user is visiting. And that is the topmost document, so the topmost web page, meaning that if you're within an iframe element, so a page within a page, you can still control that outer web page and force it basically to go wherever you want. There are some safety protections built into most web browsers to prevent malicious JavaScript from hijacking that main page, but there's still many ways to get around that. One of the common ones is through malvertising, so advertisements on a website that can use JavaScript to do dynamic actions. If it's loaded from the same domain as the original page, it has greater control over that web page. But long story short, this JavaScript basically allows an attacker with a little bit of code to hijack the web page and send the user somewhere else. And you've probably seen this type of...
Oh, yeah. Sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say, and it's very basic but effective obfuscation. I mean, as you were saying, Marc, like that whistle B up there, you see all those numbers, that's an array. And whistle A is simply the for loop is simply kind of subtracting 44 from all of those numbers. So 44 minus 163 is 119. And guess what? As Marc said, in UTF-16, that is W. And that happens to be the first letter of window top location href. So if you just increment through that array, subtracting 44 from every one of those numbers and converting it to UTF-16, you get that window top location code that Marc is talking about. And just so for the curious out there, it redirects to a site, fatforburns.tmz.com, with some
Yep.
extra stuff about a diet guide, which obviously is really a link to some malicious content. Sorry, I just wanted to point that out.
And you've probably seen this behavior before if you've been on the internet for any amount of time. It's really common in Google hijacking, where an attacker will compromise a website that ranks highly in Google, so that when you click on it, instead of like going to whatever topic you were trying to search up, suddenly you're on this page that says you've won a free vacation at Marriott if you click all these buttons and enter this other contest. That's the type of behavior that is accomplished with this type of script. So again, it was interesting seeing it pop way up to the top. Kind of makes sense though, because at least like personally, I've encountered this plenty across the internet. So it's good that we're starting to see this type of script detected and blocked by our signature-based services. Next up, I'll hand it to Corey though to go over another top threat that we had in our malware list.
Sure. And this one is Trojan Abracadabra. Pretty simple to understand. It was a malicious Excel document, but also kind of interesting. The main note about this Excel document as you got it was a encrypted Excel document. And attackers, encryption is good and bad for them. It's good because the reason they use it is to evade some security controls. You know, for word-based malware detection where you have to go in and maybe parse its contents looking for any sort of active script like VBA or macros or stuff like that, you know, obviously you would need to decrypt the document in order to do that scan. So the benefit of encrypting documents for the attacker is getting past security controls. Now, the downside to a typical encrypted file is it's encrypted and needs a password. So often the attacker has to find a way for a user to enter a password. And sometimes the email they send the encrypted file, it has the password in it. But this is a much simpler trick. We have seen it before and talked about it in our report before. While this is an encrypted file, it actually uses a default password that comes with Excel, Velvet Sweatshop. Me and Mark have no idea why Microsoft and the Excel team have Velvet Sweatshop as their default password. It's kind of unusual. But the long story short, yes, Velvet, I don't know, a sweatshop. I think of little kids working. At least they're sitting on velvet chairs while they're working to program Excel. But in any case, the cool thing about using that default one is it kind of takes away the friction from the user. The user doesn't, Excel will just open it seamlessly using that default password, so you don't have to worry about it. And yet it could evade some of the security controls that aren't able to that are doing maybe internal parsing. Now, the good news is it didn't evade us. We definitely caught this particular variant of this document. When you do open the document, it's a relatively traditional malicious Excel file. It contains a macro script that essentially tries to redirect it to a website. The website, I think, is something like couture-floor.com, and it's grabbing a malicious executable. We tried to look into what the executable did, but at the time we were analyzing the link, it had actually been taken down by one of the abuse.ca, one of the well-known kind of spam black hole lists. So we weren't able to grab the malicious executable, but some notes suggested it was some sort of generic Trojan. So kind of interesting, a neat way for malware to sneak past some security without having to worry about getting the user to type a password, and yet something that your fireboxes definitely catch. So with that, let's go ahead and talk about regions.
Yeah, so over the past few quarters, our regional breakdown of malware attacks across the world has kind of been pretty steady, like usually only fluctuating by a percentage point here or there each quarter. This quarter, though, there was actually a decent amount of change. So the Americas actually dropped 6 percentage points and the EMEA increased 4 percentage points, which, I mean, it doesn't sound like a lot, but it is still a bigger fluctuation than we've seen previously. It was interesting seeing this malware attacks spread quite evenly across the world, like from 27% to 37% isn't that big of a margin. One of the things we did notice, though, is that there was an increase in exploits targeting CVE 2017-1188-2 that Corey's mentioned a few times, specifically in the EMEA region. So we saw a larger increase in these Microsoft Office-based exploits targeting EMEA. And the reason the attackers continue to use this particular CVE and similar vulnerabilities is that end users or home users or even people in an enterprise tend to not do as hot as we would hope in keeping Microsoft Office updated, which makes it really easy for this exploit to succeed. This specific one, 2017-11-88-2, works as soon as you open the document in a vulnerable version of Microsoft Office or Microsoft Excel, and it basically gives the attacker code execution on that computer. So the takeaway from that is make sure that you are keeping your Office applications up to date with the latest security patches so that your users are safe from opening a tainted file like that.
By the way, Mark, before we move on to the network section, one of our listeners had a question about abracadabra, and I actually am not sure I know the answer, but he is curious if working these type of booby-trapped Excel files also work when using the online version. For instance, if you open that Excel document in your browser using, their new cloud online version of Excel that you can edit in the browser, do you know if VBAs and macros work in the same way?
So I believe at least the encryption portion of it will work the same way, but Microsoft's online cloud Office has a lot more protections when it comes to executing code through scripts. I don't believe that VBA scripts specifically have the same permissions and rights as they do in the Office application on a desktop. I have seen, there was a talk just this last year at Black Hat of exploiting Microsoft Office's cloud environment to gain code execution on Microsoft servers. But as a user in that environment, you tend to be somewhat removed from that whole process and more safe from this style of attack, at least using VBA scripts.
Cool. And while we're talking about regions, I'm trying to actively get to questions as I see them when they're relevant to what we're talking about. I do notice one of the listeners is talking about what does Americas include. And just so you know, it's Canada, the United States, Mexico, Brazil. Yes, it does include South America, the Caribbean, and many of those islands down there as well. Now, obviously, we only have data on where we have our particular products. So I'm not sure how many Fiji customers we have. I bet you we have at least a couple, but it does depend on who has boxes there. But when we do count the Americas, it's pretty much all the blue you see, South America and Canada. We're not.
I'll go ahead and I'll volunteer to go install a box in Fiji so we can get some threat intel from there.
I'm sure you would, but we're not the typical U.S. people that consider America just us. So it is all of it. There's another question, are there specific numbers in the Caribbean and South America? And I will say there, yes to that. All the data we use for this report is available to you on secplicity.org. I think I have a link to that at the end of this presentation, but it's just secplicity.org. And if you go to the threat landscape page, that is an interactive page that is being driven by the same data that Mark puts in our database for this particular report. And in that particular interactive page, not only can you search on custom time chunks, but you can also pick down to country. We don't have city and state yet, but we do have country details. So if you have a specific country that you want to see numbers for, a specific one in South America, for instance, or a specific Caribbean country, you can get that detail on that particular page. Now, again, the only caveat is the amount of data we have depends on our boxes there, but we have it broken down by country. So I hope that helps.
Yep.
With that said, even though we're answering questions as we go, I'd like to leave a little time for them. So let's keep moving. So Mark already mentioned that malware is down Q2, even though it got more sophisticated, likely because people are working from home. But what's also interesting is even though your employees are probably working from home, a lot of your services are still either at your physical perimeter or in your cloud perimeters too. And that is why we believe network attacks went up. We detected 1.75 million network attacks in Q2. I think that's up by just over 100,000. So it's up from Q1, and it's about 42 attacks per device. So it is interesting to see that even with remote employees being somewhere else, your perimeter is still a place folks target for any sort of network services you may be exposing to the internet. With that said, let's talk about some of the top network attacks. And this is the list that we kind of, it's hard to go into detail because there's often not a whole lot of new stuff here. We believe that's because a lot of network attacks are automated. Bad guys either have botnets that have commands to mass attack. Basically, they scan the internet, they look for open ports, and they leverage an exploit in their library whenever they find an open port for something they might have an exploit for. Or of course, penetration testing. Sometimes we use the same type of automated quote unquote attack just to test if our network is vulnerable to these things. So we think a lot of what we see in this top list is due to both malicious and legitimate automation of trying these network attacks from your services. But long story short, there was one new attack we saw this quarter, so one right in the number 6 spot or right in the middle, RPC Drupal core XML RPC endpoint. Without going into a ton of detail, that is actually a Drupal WordPress vulnerability. It's a Drupal vulnerability that affected WordPress, and it really was a DOS vulnerability. A pretty easy one to exploit too. If you still suffered from this vulnerability, it is a good 6 years old. So hopefully if you have a WordPress site, you've updated your Drupal install since then. But if you had it, it was pretty trivial for an attacker to repeatedly exploit this flaw to perhaps knock your site down. Not the most severe flaw. I can't remember the exact number. I think it might have been 2.5, but when you have CVEs, they give them severity ratings up to 10. This one was only a severity rating of, I believe, 2.5s or in the 2 point somethings, but it was very easy to exploit. So that really is the only new thing on the network attack lists. Besides that, some of the themes we continue to see remain true. I've said it 100 times, if not 1,000 times before. The web is the battleground. And what I mean by that is bad guys, threat actors out there are mostly targeting web applications, whether they be websites, online UIs, or kind of the code behind some of the SaaS applications we have out there. And you can see this because a lot of these threats are either web application attacks directly. Here you can see a lot of SQL injection. Again, SQL injection was our #1 attack. That particular signature, as well as the two signature, or the signature you see in the number 8 spot, are both signatures that kind of generically catch SQL injection. They don't catch a specific, vulnerability that affects a framework, but they catch some of the character combinations penetration testers or attackers like us would use when we're trying to exploit SQL injection. Excuse me. So web application attacks remain very high, cross-site scripting being another one. Besides that, the rest of them are other web-related flaws. They could be things like the NGX flaw at the bottom, which is a specific vulnerability in a specific web service, in this case, Nginx, but it's still a web vulnerability that bad guys leverage to take over your website. So a lot of the same stuff, but with that one WordPress flaw. I think the main takeaway here is one that Marc just mentioned. It's patching. I mean, the good news is a lot of these specific vulnerabilities, the ones that have CVEs, are very old. Like that, the WordPress Drupal one and the Nginx one are 6 and 7 years old. So you really should have patched by now. As long as you're patching, you'll do very well. The second takeaway is the reason bad guys are leveraging web application vulnerabilities is because while those sometimes rely on vulnerabilities in a specific web application, they often rely on vulnerabilities that you might have accidentally put in some of your own web code. So they rely on your web developers being good web developers and doing secure coding practices. Long story short, that means one of the best protections against those is getting your web developers or whoever you contract to do your web development to really pay attention to secure coding. We don't have time to go into all the details of how to do this, but Marc and I often recommend people to go to OWASP.org, Open Web Application Security Project.org. Send your web developers there. They have all kinds of very hard tips on how your web developers can clean up their coding and make it a little safer. Switching to widespread attacks, I'm not going to spend as much time on this slide because it really is the same story, but with a much stronger focus on web application attacks. The reason I focus so much on web application is you can tell those are the ones that affect the most people. And these are probably not necessarily automated. While they're being caught by generic signatures, I guess there's a lot of automated blind SQL injection tools out there that will go and test websites for you. But this is where a lot of hackers can be kind of checking out the custom code on your particular site. So again, same takeaway as before. If you develop your own web applications, or if you contract someone to do it, you want to make sure they're leveraging secure coding practices and doing what OWASP says. So have them check that out. Besides that, you can see some of the details about where these attacks happen. In the case of web applications, a lot of the time it is in the US. Obviously, there are quite a few popular SaaS applications that are here in the United States. But besides that, obviously, Spain, Italy, we see a lot of different countries being affected by this. But the Americas do seem to be a big target here. Whereas in other cases, we can see things like cross-site scripting is spread around the world.
One of the things I don't think we pointed out before showing those numbers was those percentages. What they boil down to is within that country, what percentage of networks experience this attack? So for example, the number one threat there, a generic cross-site scripting detection signature. In Spain, 75% of all of our networks that we protect there saw this particular threat attempt to hit them. So a lot of these are very widespread within specific countries. And even across regions, like 40 to 60% of networks within certain regions have seen some of these threats as well. So the attackers are very wide-reaching with some of their automated tools and trying to find these vulnerabilities and exploit them on unpatched networks. If we look at the geographic breakdown, though, for network attacks for the last quarter, similar, or I guess with previous quarters, again, there's been that kind of steady low fluctuation for the percentage of network attacks across the three main regions we look at. But in quarter two of this year, Corey, if you want to advance to the next slide, we actually saw a pretty decent change across a few of our regions. So America was relatively stable at 57%. I think it was only off by a point from last quarter, but EMEA actually dropped 10 points from the previous quarter, and APAC rose 7 points. And again, the reason that these aren't like perfectly weighted is, well, I guess the reason they aren't perfectly in line is because we do weight these percentages, also taking into account the number of appliances we have within any given region. That way, just because, for example, we sell significantly more in one region doesn't mean that their percentage just skyrockets. But either way, when it came to network attacks, the bulk of them were still focused on the Americas, taking up over half of all network attacks that we saw by volume once weighted for the number of appliances we had, with EMEA only taking up a quarter of them. That said, that doesn't mean you can let your foot off the gas. You still have to make sure that you are turning on your security services, keeping your exposed internet services patched with the latest updates, because all it takes is one of these automated tools to scan your network, fingerprint an out-of-date service to allow an attacker to exploit it and potentially gain a foothold on your network. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into our DNS section now. Oh,
cool, but actually, before we do, I just wanted to pause to take a few questions I didn't notice as me and Mark were speaking. I think some of these might be in network attacks, some might jump back to malware. One of them was, we talked a lot about Office attacks being pretty common, especially in widespread malware lists. And one question was, do those Office exploits work against Libre or Open Office suites? To answer that, mostly no, it depends. For instance, there are very specific, sometimes the CVEs are very specific vulnerabilities in a Microsoft Office framework, something Office does very specifically. And those obviously won't affect Open Office because it's a very specific vulnerability in Microsoft's product. However, for some of the booby-trapped things like spreadsheets, sometimes they're not really taking advantage of a super vulnerability. They're using active scripting content, which is a capability I think that is in spreadsheets and Open Office as well. So I would suspect for some vulnerabilities, yes, they could, especially things that require, things like macros or some sort of active script in a spreadsheet. There could be ways to weaponize a spreadsheet that would open in the Open Office suite as well. But a lot of the CVE vulnerabilities you see are specific to Windows or Microsoft. I'm not sure if you have any addition to that you'd want to add, Mark.
I will say it's similar to the whole Macs don't get malware argument you hear a lot, and that the reason you don't see a lot of malware signatures or detections targeting OpenOffice and Libra, for example, is because their user base is quite smaller. Attackers are going to go after whatever gives them the biggest return on investment. So they're going to typically go after whatever has the biggest market share. That said, just because you don't see them high up in volume doesn't mean that they aren't hackable.
Exist.
Exactly. They are still out there, and you still need to make sure you keep those tools updated as well.
Yeah, a good thing to do is go to, some of the DBs for CV and just look up Libre and OpenOffice, and you'll see they suffered the same type of code execution and various vulnerabilities like Microsoft Office does. So we're not necessarily, Mark's making the point, it doesn't mean OpenOffice or Libre is more secure than Microsoft's Office. They do have vulnerabilities too, so theoretically we could see them. But the volume we see are using exploits that mostly target the Microsoft variant. The one other question, I think this might come from someone who speaks another language, so hopefully I'm interpreting it right. But I think the gist of their question is, do you think we'll see an increase in Office malware? I believe it's when Office 2010 support ends, which will be very soon. I think that's October. The listener says October 13th. So will we see more vulnerabilities targeting some of these exploits when Office 2010 support goes away? There's some evidence that that does happen. Obviously, we all went through the Windows XP support going away. And if bad guys find new 0-day, that could be bad news, because if Microsoft doesn't release a patch for it, it's definitely going to be a heyday in exploiting that particular package. But it all depends on what vulnerabilities are found in it after. And the other caveat is, as some of you know, Microsoft ended XP support long ago, but there have been some vulnerabilities found since that were big enough that even Microsoft kind of broke their own end of life thing, and they released a patch even for XP because it was such a big issue. So will we see attacks and malware go up targeting Office 10? I think we'll certainly see it. We'll certainly see older Office 2010 vulnerabilities being exploited for a long time. And when support for it goes away, it could affect things. But I will say a lot of the stuff we're seeing is already patched in Office 2010 today. So even when they lose support in next October, you could have had a patch for the stuff we're seeing today. So I think it more depends on if something new is found after that date. I don't know if you had any additional thoughts there, Mark.
I will just say, don't bank on Microsoft releasing an out of support patch on Microsoft Office. If Office is critical to your organization running, as it is to most people, make sure you're using a version that is still in support so that you can get timely security patches as they become available.
Cool. So running low on time, so I'm going to go quite quickly. I'm glad we're answering questions during though. But the next section that's part of the Firebox feed is our DNS section, DNS Watch section. This is where we use DNS firewalling, as I mentioned before. If you have DNS Watch, every time your user clicks a link, before they even go to the site, the DNS lookup goes through our services to make sure it's not a malware, phishing, or compromised site link. And if it is, we'll black hole them and give them a message that they might have gone to a dangerous place. I'll start with malware. Basically, the malware category covers sites that are somehow directly malicious. They either distribute malware or they're command and control channels for malware that's out there. And there's a couple new sites on this particular list. One of them is the findresults.site domain, which actually turned out to be a command and control for a relatively old Trojan variant called Dadobra. I won't go into a ton of details on Dadobra. You can just consider it like any other Trojan that once it gets on your computer, it connects to a command and control and tries to obfuscate itself and keep persistence on your computer. And then it will try to download other executables or do other nasty stuff on your computer. As a site, just so you know, the way DNS Watch works is we get threat intelligence from a lot of sources and our own sources to find all these sites. This particular command and control channel server came to us from US CERT, one of their TLP green alerts. So just to give you an idea of how we find these bad domains, we coordinate with folks like US CERT. Another one that was new to the list was called, I'm assuming that's pronounced more like Chow, and it's Sioko chiocofrol.com. I have no clue what that domain is. But this one, I want to point out how we learned this one because it's a feature you can use as customers. One of the things you can do is if you see sites, you can manually black hole them for your users. And this was a site that one of our users actually manually black holed. And it was good they did that because we did some research and found it was another command and control server. This was used for a very old botnet called ASP Rocks, one I talked about way back in 2007. So it's 12 to 13 years old. And similar to any botnet connecting to a command and control just to show it's alive. That's essentially what this did. By the way, ASP Rocks has done all kinds of different things in its long decade life. Malware continues to evolve. Lately, though, it's been arriving as PDF documents and email, so that's what you'd want to look out for. And when it does get on your computer, it does seem to be kind of turning your computer into spammer or doing malvertisement, maybe lots of pop-up ads and things like that. I will let you cover the phishing.
With the phishing domains, this is typically the sites that are specifically doing phishing campaigns to try and steal credentials or trick your users into performing some action that you generally don't want them to do. The one I want to point out, though, is we actually saw a subdomain of VerizonWireless.com become compromised by some attacker and host a phishing campaign on Verizon's website. And the reason I want to point this out is because more often than not, we tell our users, like, highlight over the link, and if it looks like it's a legitimate website, it's probably okay, but if it looks completely bogus, then just avoid it. More and more often these days, attackers are able to compromise, either like take over a site like this or abuse things like cloudfront.net, like you see in the malware domains, or SharePoint, as you see in the phishing domains, and register their own subdomain, which then lets them host whatever they want on that and kind of piggyback off the good reputation of that main top level domain. This means that highlighting over a link and just seeing what the main domain is isn't sufficient anymore to making a definitive determination over whether it's good or bad. You still have to treat it with skepticism and be on the lookout for these phishing attacks that are now being hosted on quote unquote legitimate domains.
Cool. And by the way, we did have one question. How did VerizonWireless.com wind up on the phishing list? And that particular one was just for a very short period of time because it was hosting a genuine phish. And apparently the phishing URL could be tailored to the phish, the victim that it was trying to phish. So for a very short period of time, there was a phish on that particular link. I will say that's not unusual. You'll see in some of our past reports, we see OneDrive, SharePoint links sometimes being shown there. This is kind of tech stuff for the nerds out there, but this is also why I like using Web Blocker along with DNS Watch. DNS Watch is 100% domain based. So malware does show up on legitimate sites, as we'll talk about in a moment. But when it does, we can't always block it at the domain level, because if we blocked all of SharePoint, obviously you guys would be mad, so we can't do that. But that's why you should also pay attention to Web Blocker. Web Blocker also blocks malware sites, but it does it differently. It does it only through web connections, and it blocks down to the specific URL. So with Web Blocker, sometimes we can be much more specific about preventing you from getting to certain pages. And another addition to that is if you have Web Blocker and DNS Watch, you also have something called RED, Reputation Enabled Defense, and that's 100% URL based. So for instance, a single forum page on New York Times could be hijacked as a compromised website, and we could block that single URL, but you could still get to the rest of New York Times if you needed to. So good question. The last part of this, by the way, is compromised websites. Those are websites that have been kind of what we're talking about. They are legitimate sites that have been somehow taken over by attackers, whether via an ad inserted into it or whether a web application vulnerability exposed a vulnerability that they could actually add their own code. Could be a number of different ways. But a lot on that list, it's very common to see these sites being used for malicious purposes. Two new ones. One is the ssp.addriver in Russia. AdDriver is a legitimate network. It's used for marketing, and that SSP domain, that SSP subdomain is actually where they sometimes, the domain that sends their ads. So what usually happens here is perhaps someone that's signed up to do ads is actually a malicious person and inserted some malicious code into the advertisements. And when that gets caught, sometimes legitimate ad domains can get thrown there too. Another interesting one was technic.io. This domain is again legitimate, but it was found to be distributing FinSpy. FinSpy is, if you search on Google, you'll find that state actors have been using FinSpy to spy on pretty political folks. The particular zero-day exploit that we used to see this particular campaign targeting was a older Word one, if I believe Office document one, like the ones we've been talking about before. In fact, I think you found it in PowerPoints too. But it was basically some Office document arriving in email that was coming from that particular domain. So why don't we go into defensive tips for the Firebox feed? And we've given some throughout, but I mean, one of them is simply don't let your guard down. Despite the fact that malware has gone down a little bit, the sophistication of malware is continuing to stay high. A lot of it is evading traditional defenses. Right at the beginning, Marc talked about the importance of having more proactive anti-malware techniques like APT blocker, like intelligent AV that use machine learning or behavioral analysis to catch threats. With 67% of malware not being detected without those services, you definitely need to make sure you have all your layers, even when your folks are at home, to not let your guard down. I'll go ahead and let you do the second tip if you like, Marc.
Yeah, so again, a lot of these threats come over a JavaScript, or use JavaScript in some way because it enables a lot of additional functionality on the browser. Obviously, JavaScript is used legitimately across almost every single website, but it is exceedingly used illegitimately as well in these types of attacks, which means having a good ad blocker and a good JavaScript blocker that can block suspicious domains or suspicious scripts can go a long ways towards keeping your users safe as they browse potentially untrusted sites. And again, I say a good ad blocker or JavaScript blocker because you can't just go out and block absolutely everything. You'll basically render the internet useless. But there are ones that make it a little easier for you and your users to keep you safe while you browse across the internet.
Cool. And the last one is don't trust the site just from its domain. As you just learned, phishing sites often can use legitimate domains as part of their attack structure. Again, while it was not as much in this report, things like SharePoint, because customers can control their SharePoint instances, can often host bad stuff just as much as good stuff. Now, before we give you a really quick update to Shiny Hunters, I do want to answer really quick some questions. One, does DNS Watch Go contribute to our numbers? Unfortunately, not yet, only because right now we get this data from our Firebox feed. So it's literally from a particular bit of anonymized information we get from Fireboxes. So DNS Watch Go is not in this yet. Another real quick question I wanted to answer, because I think it's cool, is somebody asked, can you integrate Active Directory with our products so that you can get reports based on usernames? Absolutely. So few customers do this, but it's such a cool step, because not only can you go into our reporting tools like Dimension and see all this type of data we're sharing with you from a specific user perspective. I mean, you can literally click on a username and see the threats that they actually were having or the IPS hits for that particular user. But you can actually write rules based on usernames too. So I highly recommend you do that integration. And with that, I'm going to quickly turn it over to you for Shiny Hunters.
Yeah, so we go into detail in the report here, but basically what this section talks about is our top security incident for the quarter. And in this case, like we've talked about time and time again about how sadly it seems like the typical data breach isn't really a newsworthy event anymore, but every once in a while there are a series of data breaches that do become a newsworthy event. So in previous years, there's been the peace of mind breaches. So a threat actor going by peace of mind back in 2018, 2019, there was Gnostic players. And this year it's Shiny Hunters, where a specific single threat actor has released a trove of, or successfully breached a trove of organizations and either sold or dumped all that data on the dark web or underground forums. In the case of Shiny Hunters, within the first 2 weeks of May, they had released over 200 million records from a dozen and a half or so different organizations. and 500 gigabytes of source code from Microsoft's own code repository, freely available on underground hacking forums. So in the report, we go into how they might have accomplished these data breaches. It looks like they spearphished GitHub code repository credentials. So they went after developers to gain access to those GitHub accounts. And then from there, stolen secret keys or passwords that were hard-coded into the source code for these applications, and then gone after the databases that back the applications. This is a pretty common tactic. It was actually used by Gnostic players back in 2019. That actually has caused shiny hunters to be linked, at least by a few different users. It's actually been a kind of fun game of trying to guess who exactly shiny hunters are. And a few people have linked them to Gnostic players because of that. But like in the report, you'll see we go over why we do or don't think that shiny hunters are these specific individuals based off of when some of these threat actors were arrested and how shiny hunters still has remained active. Definitely check out the report for more details in that case. I will say though that all these big data breach threat actors, they do tend to get arrested. Like it doesn't take that long for one of these really high profile threat actors to come under, to be identified by law enforcement. So they most likely won't remain anonymous for long, and it'll be interesting to see who ends up being correct and who the actual shiny hunters are. As takeaways for this section though, again, check out the report where we go into more detail, but long story short, if you do maintain your own code repositories on GitHub or a similar service, make sure you're using multi-factor authentication so that if your developers do get phished, the attacker isn't able to just log in and steal your source code. And then another tip that we've talked about, usually in the IoT space, of don't hard code credentials or don't use hard coded credentials. The same tip can apply to your code as well. So if you're developing an application, don't hard code in a password to access your database or an access key to access some AWS or Azure cloud resource right into the source code. There are much more secure ways of deploying those credentials as you deploy the application itself, so that it's not in the code, which means it's much more protected in the case of scrapers that go across public repositories or a cyber criminal that manages to gain access to your private repository. And then also in a similar vein, make sure you use unique passwords for each service. This is basically the fallout from these massive breaches like shiny hunters with over 200 million records. If you use the same username and password across multiple services and one of those services gets breached in an attack like this, it makes it really easy for the attackers to use credential stuffing attacks and take those breached credentials and then go after other services you use. And it makes it, they tend to have a high rate of success, especially if you're reusing these credentials across similar services. We see them a lot in like the video game space, where a video game forum will get hacked. Their credentials will get cracked because they typically use weak hashing algorithms. And then the attackers will use those email addresses and passwords to then go after other video game forums, go after Nintendo or Xbox accounts, and then use those to do even more damages, like use your linked credit cards to buy points or gift cards, for example. So long story short, use a password manager or something similar to have unique passwords for each service, and use multi-factor authentication so one of these massive breaches doesn't affect every single one of your accounts.
So we're a bit over, but in the last minute or so, let me just quickly wind up the tips for you. And we answered a lot of questions during, but happy to take more if people want to stay late. Here's these are tips with a twist, because normally we will summarize all the tips we found from the data in the report, but me and Marc have done that throughout this talk. Instead, if you remember, there's a little hidden data from this report in that malware is down because a lot of folks are working from home. So the indirect tip from this report is you need to secure those work from home users. The first tip is implement a full endpoint protection suite. I'm sure all of you guys have endpoint protection, antivirus, But if you kind of purchased your endpoint protection to be malware specific, just that antivirus part, because you knew a lot of those devices were in the office, now that people are at home, you need to make sure that endpoint protection is a suite with every layer you need. It has to have a host firewall, it should have data encryption, system management, patching capability, and all that. So be sure to look at that. Next thing, multi-factor. I don't think I have to cover it much because Marc just talked about why it was important on your code repositories. The truth is it's important for all of your employees, especially when they're working from home. When they're from home, you don't have that door with the physical computer in your office to be part of the validation method that employee is who they say they are. Their only validation is digital, so you need to make sure you're using strong authentication with multi-factor. Another tip for working at home that you're already using, because you started this way back in March, is using VPNs. Using VPNs is great. Our Firebox and other products support them well, but you need to now take your VPN setup to phase 2. A VPN, as secure as it is getting an employee into your network, if their actual endpoint is taken over, it can actually become a backdoor into your network as well, unless you check their endpoint first. So this kind of correlates back to use endpoint software. Besides the endpoint protection suite, make sure your VPN has some sort of validation method to check the health of the host before it goes back in. And just so you know, that is a feature of our threat detection and response, which is one of the security service that comes with WatchGuard's total security. And finally, DNS filtering, we talked about it, but we do have a product called DNS Watch Go. Not only do we have DNS Watch at the Firebox, which you saw the stats for, we have the one that works for your home users even when they're at home. So be sure to use that. Sorry for going a bit over. You can find a whole lot more about our content at secplicity.org, which is the site you see at the bottom left here. So feel free to go there. Also know we're publishing this report at midnight tonight. It has a whole lot more details than me and Marc were able to cover, so check it out. And you can go to the threat landscape page. But with that, we're a bit over. If I've gotten any more questions, I'll go ahead and answer them for the folks staying late. But for the folks that aren't, thank you very much for your time. So looking at questions really quick, I see one person asking about passwords. Speaking of passwords, right now I've heard a 12-character password is good. Do you see 16 characters or longer in this year or next? And my answer, I'll let Marc throw in too, is yes. I actually don't think a 12-character password's been good for a long time. My old advice was at least 14. Part of that is to do with legacy issues. If you know anything about NT-Landman, the old way Windows stored passwords, it would take a 14-character password and break it into 2 7-character ones. So the value of over 7 characters was kind of broken by NT-Landman. But that aside, between rainbow tables and distributed computing power, 12 has been cracked long ago for hashes and passwords, at least unsalted ones. And I think 14 is, I have a rainbow database that I think goes up to 14 already. So frankly, I believe in 16 or longer. I think I have my password manager set to 24. The beauty that I think me and Marc always recommend is password managers. The strong password advice we would give you is too hard for a human to follow. You know, I would tell you to have a 24-character password, make it random, and have it different for every single thing. No human can remember that, but guess what? A password manager can. You don't have to remember anything but one master password. Your master password, if you create a passphrase, kind of a sentence with punctuation, it automatically will be above 16 characters. So anyways, my advice is 16 above. I'm not sure, just because Rainbow Tables has got people at least to 14 already. But do you have any additional advice there, Marc?
Yep, I agree. I think my password manager is set to default to 20 characters, and the only time I go less than that is if a specific website requires it. It does look like we are getting kicked off here, though. So the rest of the questions we'll be able to answer via email, hopefully by the end of the day or tomorrow. We'll definitely get back to you as soon as possible on them. Thanks again for checking us out in this webinar, and take a look out for that report on secplicity.org at midnight tonight.
Yep, thanks guys.